You need to calm down. Because I'm starting to sweat. I always sweat with these flipping videos. Hello, everybody. My name is Ben, and today I want to talk about Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre! This is by Charlotte Bronte, and oh my goodness, I finished reading this last night. It's the first time I've read it, and I very much would like to talk about it at length. So I'm a bit conflicted on how to approach this video because on the one hand, I want to recommend it. If you haven't read it, I want to recommend it to everyone. You have to read this book. But I want to talk about this I want to get into it. I want to talk about all the plots and twists and turns and stuff. And so that means that at some point in this video, I'm going to go into spoilery stuff. So my plan of action is that I'm just going to ramble. I'm just going to regurgitate my unsolicited opinions, and then we'll just fix it in post, and hopefully, we'll all the spoilery stuff will be at the latter end of the video. So yeah, I'll try and give an indication of when I'm going to talk about spoilery stuff. So the only other Bronte novel of the sisters that I had read was Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I read that last year, and that Wuthering Heights is pretty bonkers. It's if you've read it, then you know it's it's very, very intense and kind of passionate and like, and as I say, it's just absolutely bonkers. And so I wasn't really sure what to expect with Jane Eyre. I wasn't sure whether it was going to be the same kind of like, I'm going to dig up your bones sort of thing, or whether it would be something different. And it is different. I mean, this is a completely different author. Flipping heck, calm down, Ben. So, yes, so I didn't really know much about it other than it was Jane Eyre, Mr. Rochester, and something scary in the attic. That's all I knew about Jane Eyre. So Jane Eyre as a character, she is awesome, isn't she? I love Jane Eyre as a character. So at the start of the novel, we meet her when she's about 10, and right away the book is quite intense, and straight away I was like, okay, we're back to the Bronte sisters. Okay, I'm gonna dig up your bones. And she's living with her aunt. Her parents have died, and she's living with her aunt and cousins who are really, really nasty to her. And I was reading it and I was like, oh no, this is like Mansfield Park all over again, except instead of kind of not including her in things, they're actually throwing books at her and punching her and locking her up in scary haunted rooms and stuff. And this is awful. And I was like, oh God. But Jane Eyre is no Fanny Price. I mean, we all love Fanny Price, but in this situation, Jane Eyre is Jane Eyre. And at the start of the novel, we kind of find her, even though she's 10 years old, we find her kind of at the end of her tether, and she's like, right, I've had enough of all this. And so she kind of defends herself. She sort of fights back. And this causes Mrs. Reed, her aunt, to kind of be like, I'm going to send you to this awful school. I'm going to rid you forever. And so she does. She sends her to this very, very strict sort of puritanical, if that's the right word, school. But before she goes, Jane Eyre decides to, as the saying goes, cut a bitch. And she basically lays into Mrs. Reed and says, you are a nasty, evil woman, and here's why. And I don't deserve anything the things that you've done to me, and here's why. And you're a nasty woman, and I'll never forgive you. Goodbye. And Mrs. Reed is like, so it has the desired effect. And when I read that sort of speech from Jane Eyre, a 10-year-old Jane Eyre, I was like, yes! Okay, right, Jane Eyre, she is fabulous. So yeah, she does go to this very, very strict school, and it's run by Mr. Brocklehurst, who is this really, he's got my nose, and he's all like, he's one of those. And it's kind of, you think, oh no, she's going to have this terrible time at this school. However, there is a there is a nice teacher there. She's kind of, I can't remember what the teacher in Matilda is called, Miss Honeysuckle or whatever the name is, but she's kind of like that. She's like a nice teacher, and she's even though it's a very strict and kind of quite sort of, you don't really want to go to school at this place, but even so, she's quite a nice teacher, and so Jane Eyre's like, I can handle it here, and she does. And she becomes a teacher there herself when she gets a little bit older. But at 18, she decides to. That teacher kind of leaves and gets married, and so Jane Eyre decides that it's time to move on and to get a job. I got work to do. So yes, and then she goes to Thornfield Hall, to be a governess for Adele, who is the ward of Mr. Rochester. The great thing about those early chapters is we see her defend herself, and we see her kind of learn how to hold herself and how to kind of handle duress. So anytime someone is kind of a bit nasty or a bit kind of like to her, she's like, okay, I know how to handle this. And either she kind of just sort of holds herself with dignity and poise, but if someone kind of says something to her, then she's very quick to kind of say something back. And Mr. Rochester, she at the start she knows exactly how to handle him, because he's kind of a bit sort of weird to her, but she kind of like, she is able to sort of give the same back to him. Now Mr. Rochester, am I saying that name right? Mr. Rochester? Mr. Rochester. So Mr. Rochester, he's kind of one of these sort of characters who is, I mean, he's emotionally manipulative, he's possessive, he's a bit up himself, but at the same time, he's still a bit sexy, isn't he? He's still a bit sexy. I mean, Charlotte Bronte, she takes pains to sort of, through the novel, say that he's not actually that handsome. But, I mean, he's got the broad chest, and he's got this kind of like thing about him. And I guess that kind of confidence and that kind of arrogance can be quite sort of, it's quite sort of sexy. However, he is a bit of a dick. I hate testers. Mr. Rochester is a tester, and I don't like testers. Are we, it's 2020. Are we shagging or are we not? What are we doing, eh? So yeah, so when he starts to get more passionate, and when Jane Eyre kind of inevitably starts to get more sort of the hots for him, all this kind of self-preservation stuff starts to unravel, and she doesn't quite know how to handle her emotions with him. So she kind of does that thing that a lot of us, like I do, which is like, no, I'm not, no, that sort of thing, where the self-preservation and the the self-guarding actually becomes a hindrance. Now, as for the scary thing in the attic, I love this part of the book. There's something so kind of like, Thornfield Hall has a scary third story. It's basically an attic, but with rooms. And, if you go into any kind of old mansion which has an attic with rooms, then you kind of know not to really go up there. And there's a servant called Grace Poole who kind of likes to hang out in this attic. And not that this is sinister at all, but she likes to hang out there and laugh to herself and mumble to herself. And Jane Eyre is like, what the flip is going on up in the attic? So now we're at the spoilery stuff. I feel like we're over halfway through the book. So yes, this is sort of spoilery stuff. So yeah, about halfway through the book, this passion that Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester have is kind of really kind of brought together, and I think he proposes, and Jane Eyre's like, yes. He's very tall, and I was like, this is halfway through the book. Something is afoot. And of course, you get the big downpour and the thunder, the lightning striking the tree and everything. And I was like, something's going to happen. Something's going to happen. So the secret of the scary thing in the attic is revealed, and so Jane Eyre, she she decides to leave quite sort of abruptly. There's this amazing bit where there's a lot of amazing bits in this book, but there's an amazing kind of passionate thing between Jane and Mr. Rochester, where he's like, please let's be my mistress, or please just be with me, and Jane's like, no, I can't be with you. You'd be a bigamist. I love you. And it's this thing about control, which is sort of echoed later, that Mr. Rochester kind of really, he really wants her under his own terms, and Jane Eyre is like, no, I want to be in this relationship under my own terms as well. And since she can't have that, she leaves, in a very kind of like dramatic way. And I was kind of like, it's interesting kind of looking at this from a modern day perspective, because I was kind of like, I want you to stay with Mr. Rochester, even though he's an arsehole. But of course she doesn't. She does the sort of the Christian thing, and she's like, no, I shall not be a mistress. I'm going to go off and be homeless, and yes, I shall face the elements. But this is the great thing about this book, is that it's all about Jane Eyre having her own autonomy and her own decisions about how she is going to live her life, even if how she's going to live her life, is not going to be particularly comfortable or happy. So yeah, so Jane Eyre, she's sort of on the she's on the sort of the moors, and she's all being very kind of Wuthering Heightsy, and she becomes a beggar essentially, and she stumbles across this house. Eventually, she stumbles across this house with these two sisters, and their brother, Mr. St. John, who is a pastor, a sort of very, very, very pastor, and he kind of he takes her in, and they basically bring her back to health. And because they can see that she's got sort of flying clothes on and she's got an articulacy, they're like, who is this woman? I have to say, I was so nervous in those last. I was from the moment that Mr. St. John appears, I was like, he likes to spend time with her, and Jane Eyre is kind of she doesn't really mind hanging around with him, and I was like, Jane, just. So yeah, so she kind of convinces herself that her life in this tiny village, teaching these very, very poor kids, is kind of like a life for her. Oh yes, and before that, we have the terrible Mrs. Reed kind of conclusion of her arc, where we learn that she really is an evil person, because Jane Eyre apparently has a very, very wealthy uncle who wanted to bring her up, who wanted to take Jane Eyre on, but Mrs. Reed was like, no, Jane Eyre can't have nice things. Jane Eyre can't have nice things. So she kind of, I don't know what she did. She wrote back to the uncle and said, sorry, Jane Eyre has died. Sorry. And I was like, ooh, you nasty woman. Yeah, and so yeah, Mrs. Reed, I can't really remember what happens, but she, even though I've read it yesterday, but she kind of becomes delirious before she dies, and Jane Eyre kind of is by her bedside, and she's like, can you at least just like be nice to me, at one point in your life, even if it's just the very last breath, can you just be nice to me? And Mrs. Reed is like, no. So yeah, so with Mr. St. John, you kind of know what's coming. However, I did not really see what is actually coming, which is Mr. St. John wants to be a missionary. He wants to go to India and sort of be a missionary there. And he takes Jane Eyre out for a little walk, and he's like, this is what's going to happen. We're going to marry, and we're going to be missionaries together in India. And Jane Eyre is like, I beg your pardon. And Mr. St. John's like, we're going to marry, and you're going to be a missionary with me in India? And Jane Eyre's like, I don't think that's going to happen. And he's like, yes, it is. And she's like, no, it's not. And he's like, yes, it is. No, no, no. That chapter, that kind of yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, is so, it's so stressful and tense because we know that Jane Eyre is very kind of resolute, and she knows herself, enough to be like, I know when to say no to something. And, through this kind of like argument, she says to herself, like, I can't marry this man. If there's no love there, I can't marry this man to go to India. I'm going to India at that time is certain death for me. And if I go with him as a missionary, there's what's in it for me if he's not going to love me as a wife, really. I'm just his kind of his assistant. And so she says, like, if you really want me to go, I will go as your assistant, but I won't go as your wife. And he's like, no, you're going to go as my wife because it's weird. It's weird if you come with me as just my assistant. It's weird. That's his argument. And she's like, it's not weird. It's just I don't know what. There's no love. You don't love me. I don't love you. Like, what's the issue? And he's like, the issue is that the issue is that it is ordained for you to be my wife. And it's just like this. I was really scared that Jane Eyre was going to be like, well, it is my destiny to go to India. And I was like, don't you, Jane Eyre, don't you dare. But the church bit, I was like, that was a Jane Eyre, don't you dare bit. And it gets a bit kind of like a little bit sort of, not supernatural, but Jane. Yeah, so the bit in the church where she almost sort of goes like, all right. He's got very much 50 no's and a yes means yes energy, Mr. St. John. Yeah, so she almost sort of says yes, but then she gets called from the ether. Mr. Rochester calls her from the ether. And so she decides she has to sort of see what's happened to him. So yes, this came completely out of left field. I was not expecting this ending at all. So yeah, so she goes back and she finds Thornfield Hall has been completely burnt to a crisp. And she's like, and she goes off to find, she goes to the inn and says like, what's happened to Mr. Rochester? And the truth is revealed, and I was like, oh, we're back into Bronte territory. This is the Bronte territory I know. When you find out what's happened to Mr. Rochester, I was like, woo, I beg your pardon. So yeah, of course. So the is her name Bertha? Her actual name? I think her name's actual Bertha. I want a novel about her. I think that's be really interesting. Not to get all kind of like PC about it, but I kind of want that perspective of someone who is mentally unwell, what that's kind of like in that era, and to be kind of regarded as a lunatic and to be shut up in an attic. If there is a book out there that is from her point of view, I would be very, very interested in it. Because in this, because she is the monster. She's the monster in the attic, and of course she isn't a monster. She is a person. And Jane Eyre, she does recognise that. She does recognise that she is a person, and that she is his wife, and kind of she's not a monster. So she finds Mr. Rochester in his state, and I was like, oh please, Charlotte Bronte, just. I actually spoke out loud to the book. I was like, Charlotte Bronte. Yeah, those last sort of few chapters before the last chapter, I was so stressed. I was like, can you please, Jane Eyre, can you do the right thing? Can you just give in to your passions? Can you give in to love, please? I want to read you this. So this is kind of a spoilery thing, but I want to read you this bit because it is just, if I can find it, Yeah, so I want to read this bit because it's near the end, so it's a bit spoilery. But I thought this was just like, so yeah, so he's basically saying like, how can you love me? I am like the tree that got struck by lightning. I'm a ruined person, and there's no way you can love me. And so she replies, "You are no ruin, sir. No lightning-struck tree. You are green and vigorous. Plants will grow about your roots whether you ask them or not, because they take delight in your bountiful shadow. And as they grow, they will lean towards you and wind round you, because your strength offers them so safe a prop." Oh my flipping heck! That's what you want to hear, isn't it? So, so I was just like, oh, please do the right thing, because I wasn't convinced that Charlotte was going to Charlotte Bronte was going to sneak in a sort of a last minute plot twist. I was really thinking it's going to turn out that Mr. Rochester started the fire himself and he murdered his wife, and so Jane Eyre has to be like, oh no, morals. I have to go with Mr. St. John. I really thought that was what was going to happen. So when that final chapter, the first line of that final chapter was, "Reader, I married him," I literally punched the air like this. I was like, yes! Yes! I was so happy. Yeah, I was just so happy. And it just, the way it ends is so nice. And yeah, I was just so kind of like, oh! And when I finished it, I knew that this is going to be one of my top books of the year. And also, I mean, I really loved this book a lot. I really loved this book a lot. I adored this book, and I think I adored it because, I mean, first of all, Jane Eyre, she is an awesome character. She's able to defend herself in the face of duress. She's able to sort of stick to her guns and sort of say, "You're an arsehole" to people. But she has an inner kind of, she has like her own kind of, she's very flawed. She doesn't know how to handle, she doesn't know how to handle niceness. She doesn't know how to handle love, and the kind of passionate love. Edit. She does know how to handle passionate love, but only if it aligns with her deep Christian values. It's paced. I mean, it's a big old book. It's about 500 pages, but it's paced really well. The story kind of twists and turns in the right kind of way. The scary bits are scary. The stressful bits are stressful, and yeah, I loved the ending. I just loved that ending. I thought it was so. They lived happily ever after. So in conclusion, flipping heck, I don't know how I'm going to edit this video together, but in conclusion, I love this book. If I were to give it a rating, it would be a 10 out of 10. I think it is a classic everyone should read. If you've read it, then you know. But if you haven't read it for a while, then reread it again. Yeah, it's a good one. I really enjoyed it. Charlotte Bronte. So yeah, I'd be really interested to know what your thoughts about this book are. What you thought when you initially read it. Kind of how it's how your opinion of it has changed over time. Yeah, it's definitely going to be. It's definitely going to be within the top 10. It's definitely going to be within the top 5, and I dare say it's going to be within the top 3 of the books that I read this year. I loved it a lot. So there we go. It's done. It's over. Thank you very much for watching. I shall see you next time. Hopefully I'll be more to the point next time. And yes, goodbye. I'm gonna dig up your bones!